June 22nd, 1941. Dawn has yet to break. 3 million German troops stormed the Russian border as the Nazis launched the biggest military assault in history. Stalin has retreated to his dacha. The country's leader and one of the world's most feared dictators drinks himself into a stupor for 9 days as the Wehrmacht gorges itself on his beloved motherland. Despite warnings from British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and the U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt that the invasion was imminent, Stalin dismissed their warnings as a capitalist plot designed to undermine the pact he'd made 2 years earlier with Adolf Hitler. Only as the iron columns of the Wehrmacht poured over Russia's borders did he realize how utterly he'd been betrayed. Before the year is out, another of the world's great powers will be similarly surprised by the enemy. President Roosevelt has done his utmost to keep Americans out of war, confident in his belief that the Axis powers would never dare to take on the might of the United States. On the morning of Sunday, December 7th, he, like Stalin, will be undone by a devastating strike designed to inflict maximum damage and loss of life in the shortest possible time. While the president is enjoying Sunday lunch at the White House, an Imperial Japanese strike force torpedoes America's Pacific Fleet stationed at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. In a matter of minutes, Roosevelt's hopes of staying out of the war are destroyed. An aerial assault by the Japanese and a land invasion by a supposed ally have caught Roosevelt and Stalin completely by surprise. Now these ideologically opposed leaders need to somehow work together if they're to have any hope of defeating the combined might of Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and Fascist Italy. The morning of Sunday, December 7th, 1941 would change history.
A date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked.
In a matter of minutes, 2 devastating attacks by hundreds of Japanese planes carrying bombs and aerial torpedoes left 18 American warships in smoking ruin. 2,403 U.S. service personnel dead and 188 aircraft destroyed. Yet, at the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor, America was not at war. The President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had won the 1940 U.S. election on a promise that the country would remain neutral. A series of neutrality acts was passed by U.S. Congress, which banned American citizens from trading with any nations at war, a move intended to keep the U.S. out of any international disputes.
And essentially what they do is they say if a war is declared, and particularly if the president says that there is a war ongoing, then it limits the abilities of the United States to trade with those nations. In a sense, it's trying to constrain the United States, but it's also especially trying to constrain the president as well, because they're sort of looking back to World War I, when Woodrow Wilson was president, and they had an attitude that Woodrow Wilson had sort of overstepped the mark and made the United States more likely to be drawn into this European war.
With the country only just emerging from the Great Depression, many felt America had enough problems of her own, and Roosevelt, an astute politician, was only too aware of public opinion.
Roosevelt does not want another war. And he believes, up until really the last minute, that Hitler can be appeased in some way, or certainly up to the time of the Munich Agreement. Therefore, he supports Chamberlain in his policies of appeasement. Famously, after Munich in September of 1938, he sends Chamberlain a two-word telegram, "good man." He believes, against sort of expectations perhaps, that Hitler in some way can be constrained and that he can be controlled.
I hope the United States will keep out of this war. I believe that it will. And I give you assurance and reassurance that every effort of your government will be directed toward that end.
Roosevelt, a Democrat, had decided to stand for a third term as president, something no one had ever achieved in U.S. history. This was despite the partial paralysis he had suffered from contracting polio when he was 39, leaving him wheelchair-bound.
Roosevelt is a fascinating character and one of the most wily politicians of the 20th century. And the way he behaved and the way he got himself re-elected in December 1940 is an absolute masterclass of politics. That he could present himself as someone who was not scared of getting involved in Europe if the circumstances required it.
He's quite clever, really, in that he stays out of it for a large part. He sends proxies out to do most of the work for him. What that is doing, of course, is shielding him, but it's also allowing him to be presidential, to show that he is doing the job, that he's standing up for the United States and he's trying to keep the US out of the war.
His Republican opponent, businessman Wendell Willkie, played on the public's fear of war, arguing that a Roosevelt victory would mean wooden crosses for American boys. The polls swung against FDR, and he was forced to insist there would be no foreign wars, carefully chosen words that crucially did not preclude responding to an attack on American territory.
Roosevelt had to make a famous promise at Boston days before the election that he would not let American boys fight in a foreign war. And he did not add the usual condition, unless we are attacked first.
To keep voters happy, America needed to remain neutral. But when war broke out in Europe, Roosevelt's speech to the nation revealed his personal beliefs.
This nation will remain a neutral nation, but I cannot ask that every American remain neutral in thought as well. Even a neutral has a right to take account of facts. Even a neutral cannot be asked to close his mind or to close his conscience.
We now know his personal thoughts were far from neutral. He'd corresponded secretly with Churchill about how Hitler could be defeated, even before Churchill had become prime minister.
Roosevelt did hope that he could aid the Allies to win the war, but not get the United States involved. So it was a very fine line that he was walking that wasn't quite isolationist, but wasn't quite interventionist. It was non-active intervention, which is a very complex idea, but very typical of the way that Roosevelt conceived of things.
In November 1939, Roosevelt introduced a cash-and-carry policy, allowing Britain to buy and collect weapons from America in their own ships in order that they might gain access to materials and supplies as quickly as possible. Whatever his public statements, many historians now believe that Roosevelt's actions suggest he privately wanted America to enter the war. After Churchill became prime minister, the U.S. president resupplied the troops rescued from Dunkirk and leased Britain 50 destroyers, saying that he wanted America to be the great arsenal of democracy.
In 1940, the United States still had 10 million people unemployed, and war orders from France and from Britain, from the other allies, helped to drag the American economy finally out of recession, so that the arsenal of democracy idea was clearly self-interested, clearly served domestic American goals and Roosevelt's own political goals, but also, I think, seemed to him the way in which the United States could contribute most clearly to the Allied war effort and wouldn't involve all the complications of America entering the war.
This also suited Churchill.
It was very important for the British, both in terms of the material itself, And in some crucial areas, the Americans were supplying things that the British simply couldn't supply.
Churchill had been pushing the men's friendship to breaking point as he lobbied continually for America's entry into the war. The U.S. was helping Britain and buying itself time. As Secretary of War Henry Stimson admitted, "We find ourselves unprepared and unarmed, facing a thoroughly prepared and armed potential enemy." Neutrality wasn't just about a principle, it was about survival. By late 1940, Britain had defied the odds to win the Battle of Britain. But people were now enduring nightly bombings as the Blitz hit towns and cities all over the country. And as a result of being at war for more than a year, Britain was almost bankrupt.
Churchill put as much pressure on Roosevelt as he could by pleading with Roosevelt, by a number of public speeches where he tried to align the British cause with American interests. But by the end of 1940, when Britain's financial situation was getting very bad, Britain simply couldn't afford to pay for the aid. And up to that point, they'd had to pay for it in cash. Churchill begins to pressure Roosevelt in a different way by essentially dangling over him the prospect that, that Britain is going to have to give in because it simply cannot afford to buy American aid anymore. And that, of course, as Churchill knew, confronted Roosevelt with having to go and tell the American public, who had very nicely paid jobs supplying all this material for the British, that they would now lose those jobs because Britain was no longer going to be able to provide the money.
Between September 1940 and May 1941, 43,000 British civilians were killed and 139,000 wounded in the Blitz. The Germans hoped these bombing raids on towns and cities would not only destroy British infrastructure, but also her morale.
I think aerial bombardment of civilians, which is basically what the Blitz was, it can have perhaps one of two outcomes. One is the psychological surrender of those suffering the bombing, or the opposite, stiffening their resolve. You know, to hell with you, we're not giving in to this. And I think it was the latter reaction which found its place in London, Coventry, and all the other cities bombed.
Churchill pleaded with FDR to give us the tools and we'll finish the job.
Churchill very much set out to, as he later said, woo Roosevelt like a maid and persuade Roosevelt to take action. And Roosevelt knew perfectly well that that was what Churchill was doing.
How could FDR balance Britain's desperate need for supplies on credit with the pressure to appear neutral? Ingeniously, he disinterred an old law from 1892 and repurposed it as Lend-Lease, an idea he compared to lending something to your neighbor.
The Americans were not allowed to lend money to people who were at war. That's what the American Neutrality Acts were really about. So Lend-Lease was a way of getting around that, of exploiting a loophole in the legislation, effectively, whereby they would be, rather than lending money to Britain, they would be paying for the use of certain British assets, bases in Bermuda, the Caribbean, these sorts of things.
Lend-Lease meant, as Roosevelt explained both in a press conference and in one of his fireside chats, was that you don't actually require payment in cash. When your neighbour asks to borrow your hose to put out a fire in your home, you say certainly. You can use the hose, and once the fire is put out, you can either return it to me, or if it's been destroyed, you can buy another hose and give me that. But a good neighbour will not ask for immediate payment in cash.
Lend-Lease led to a ferocious debate in Congress. Britain still owed the U.S. money from the First World War, but Roosevelt won the day, and in March 1941, $7 billion was agreed. For Churchill, there was a heavy price to be paid. the U.S. commandeered what was left of Britain's gold reserves and overseas investments due to the nature of the cash-and-carry agreement. Lend-Lease was the only method that could now aid Britain in the war. Britain was not the only beneficiary of the new policy.
Our most useful and immediate role is to act as an arsenal for them as well as for ourselves.
The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939 had enabled Hitler to occupy much of Europe without fear of Russian reprisals. But when it was torn asunder by the German invasion of Russia in June 1941, known as Operation Barbarossa, Stalin's unprepared military was caught entirely by surprise. And many in the West were concerned there was a genuine risk that the Nazis could gain complete control of the world's largest country.
The Americans did take great interest in the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, but the interest and the attitude sort of depended really on whether people thought that the Soviet Union needed to be helped to defend themselves against the Nazis, or in fact that they sort of deserved everything that they got for doing the pact with the Nazis in the first place.
However, when Stalin finally emerged from a week of drunken despair, he didn't capitulate. He turned to the capitalists and asked to join Lend-Lease.
This was actually a big compromise on his part because for the years before the start of the war, Stalin had seen Britain and America as major enemies. You know, this fit with his kind of ideological view of the world that saw things in a very black and white sense. You know, there was communism versus capitalism. But now he had to make a deal with the capitalist powers in order to beat Hitler.
Roosevelt granted him $1 billion of interest-free credit in supplies and raw materials. Stalin expressed his heartfelt gratitude for this urgent aid in the fight against the common enemy, bloodthirsty Hitlerism.
I think that Stalin saw Allied aid as central to Soviet victory in the war. This is because so much of the Soviet economy had been turned over to military production and fighting the Nazis. Without Allied aid, the Soviet Union would not have been able to feed its people. And this is why it was of central importance. And Stalin understood this. So the real contribution from the Americans and the British, aside from the military resources that they did send over, was the food supply.
But despite the aid agreements, the Big Three were by no means aligned in their aims and ambitions. By the summer of 1941, Stalin's Russia was battling for its life against the largest land invasion in history. Churchill's Britain was bombed and near bankrupt. While militarily, Roosevelt's America still stood on the sidelines. By contrast, Hitler and Mussolini's alliance was holding strong, and they took pleasure in parading their close relationship in front of the cameras in a series of highly publicized meetings. To strengthen Anglo-American relations, Churchill felt it was essential that he meet Roosevelt face-to-face. In August 1941, the Battle of the Atlantic was at its height, with German U-boats, Luftwaffe, and Kriegsmarine viciously patrolling the ocean. The journey was considered so dangerous, Churchill had to seek the King's permission first. But despite the dangers, Churchill secretly boarded the HMS Prince of Wales at Falmouth and set sail to meet the U.S. president.
Churchill very much hoped when he crossed the Atlantic to finally meet Roosevelt that Roosevelt's agreeing to the meeting signaled the fact that Roosevelt had finally decided to bite the bullet and join in the war. So he was hoping for a declaration of war or the promise that the United States would become properly active in the war. He, of course, was quite disappointed.
It was the first time the two leaders had met as heads of government. Over 4 days, from the 9th to the 12th of August 1941, Roosevelt and Churchill had a series of secret meetings aboard naval ships off the coast of Newfoundland.
Roosevelt didn't want the American public to know until he'd had the meeting, because he wanted to make sure that he could get the result he wanted, which was the Atlantic Declaration.
Churchill arrived with a long wish list of munitions and supplies, but he also had a burning desire to bring America into the war immediately, a point he emphasized by having Roosevelt join him in singing the hymn "Onward Christian Soldiers Marching as to War" in front of the news cameras. But Roosevelt had his own agenda. Roosevelt wanted grand objectives to justify the war towards which he was gradually guiding America, an idealistic plan for the post-war world, a special relationship between the men and their countries.
And when they met together at Placenta Bay and met for the first time since they had originally met in the First World War or after the First World War, and they sang hymns, and a genuine friendship started to grow from that moment because they were able to sit down and recognize in each other what it is exactly they wanted to happen. And they were very happy to work together.
It's quite clear that they enjoyed each other's company. And in a war that was run by some very significant close personal relationships between very powerful leaders, having a relaxed personal relationship was very important, when a lot of the communication, of course, has to be conducted at a distance, by telephone call and by letter and by telegram.
Famously, when Winston Churchill went to visit the White House after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and he stood up, by accident the president walked on him in the bath, and he stood up and he said, without his towel, he said, "I have nothing to hide from the President of the United States."
The trouble was that Churchill and Roosevelt saw the world in very different ways. Churchill wanted to protect the British Empire, whereas Roosevelt wanted to end European imperialism and open the world to American influence. To remain allies, they had to find common ground quickly. The two men worked together behind the scenes to devise what was to become known as the Atlantic Charter. The agreement rejected territorial aggrandizement, affirmed national self-determination, promised improved labor standards, economic advancement, and social security, and against Churchill's wishes to the contrary, an end to colonialism.
And ultimately what he's hinting at is that he wants to get rid of empires, and that's the real point of controversy between him and Churchill when they meet. And Churchill has a little clause inserted trying to sort of make out the present regimes, the imperial regimes, will sort of be allowed to stay, but Churchill knows that ultimately Roosevelt wants to end them.
Basically, one of the main planks of it was to articulate the wish of self-determination, but in Churchill's interpretation, that meant Europe. In Roosevelt's, it meant the wider colonial world.
Despite their differences, the Newfoundland meeting cemented their friendship. Roosevelt cabled Churchill after the meeting, "It is fun to be in the same decade with you." Churchill later wrote, "I felt I was in contact with a very great man who was also a warm-hearted friend."
So much of the war aims, as articulated in several of their discussions, as well with Stalin, involved thinking of, liberating Europe from, if you like, the Nazi fascist empire. But then, of course, the ramification of that would mean potentially, especially in Roosevelt's understanding, that would also mean self-determination for the British Empire as well, for places like India, but also Africa and other parts. Well, that could be the implication taken. And with the Atlantic Charter, this was a point of contention between Churchill and Roosevelt.
They chose to repeat this successful meeting. Newfoundland was to be the first of 9 face-to-face conferences. The Atlantic Charter was signed on September 24, 1941 by the USSR and the 9 exiled governments of occupied Europe, Belgium, Czechoslovakia, Greece, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Poland, Yugoslavia, and by the representatives of General de Gaulle of France.
It's an important document in that it sets out these aims for the post-war world, and in many ways what it's doing is it's picking up where the United States left off after World War I, and that Woodrow Wilson had his 14 points which he articulated for the post-World War I order, and so Roosevelt's really taking some of those and saying that what he wants to achieve is a freer world, economically. He wants a freer democratic system.
The Atlantic Charter was what we're fighting for, and although America was not yet in the war, it was the Anglo-American way of saying the world we want to live in after the war is one where we don't have Hitlerism or Italian fascism.
But despite the success of the meeting, the Atlantic Charter failed to persuade the American public that the U.S. should join the war. Supporters saw it as groundbreaking and world-changing. Leading isolationists saw the Charter as evidence of a secret commitment by Roosevelt to pull the United States into war. But the U.S. was about to become the victim of an unexpected and devastating attack. Getting 12 nations to sign an agreement as far-reaching as the Atlantic Charter was a remarkable achievement.
But Roosevelt, like Churchill, appreciated the addition to the Allied cause of Soviet power. He couldn't promise American material aid quite yet because he'd have to persuade Congress to extend Lend-Lease to the Soviet Union, but very early on indicates to the Soviets that they can expect that as soon as he can manage it. And most significantly, he sends his right-hand man, Harry Hopkins, to the Soviet Union towards the end of July to see Joseph Stalin, to actually make an assessment as to whether the Soviet Union is going to survive and to open up relations. And Harry Hopkins comes back and reports in a very positive way about the Soviet war effort and about the Soviet determination, despite their early defeats, to carry on fighting.
For his part, Churchill lost no time in condemning the invasion of the Soviet Union. The night after it began in June 1941, he addressed the British nation, describing Barbarossa as an outrage and a turning point in the war.
His invasion of Russia is no more than a prelude to an attempted invasion of the British Isles.
I think what Churchill saw, and again this goes back to Churchill being pragmatic, was an opportunity. And that is that he recognized that this was a moment to bring Joseph Stalin in on his own side. I think Churchill quite early on recognized that Soviet Russia was less of a threat than Nazi Germany.
While Churchill was extending his friendship and support to Stalin, Hitler, who only weeks before had been Russia's ally, was now waging what he called a war of destruction against a nation of subhumans.
The Germans make very quick gains in 1941, partly because Stalin had done so little preparation. He'd ordered his troops not to do anything provocative, not to give Hitler a reason to launch the attack. And so that means that the Germans could just kind of go like a knife through butter through the European part of the Soviet Union.
The Germans were carrying out a three-pronged attack on the USSR. Their southern assault was on the Ukraine region. The northern advance tore through Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, powering on to its main objective, Leningrad, while the central path of the attack was the route to Moscow. Between 17 and 25 million Soviet citizens were forced to flee from the western borders of the country to the east and south. Stalin's refusal to plan for a Nazi betrayal meant there were insufficient resources, and many evacuees suffered from exposure and malnutrition. As the Germans advanced towards the Soviet capital, they killed or captured more than 500 Soviet soldiers near the cities of Bryansk and Vyazma, the last substantial strongholds of the Red Army that stood between the Germans and Moscow. But despite the heavy losses, the Soviets were proving resilient. The USSR fielded more than 1 million soldiers and 1,000 tanks to defend Moscow. Women and children joined their menfolk to dig multiple defensive lines. The Nazis would not be gifted Moscow. Another Soviet success in the immediate aftermath of the invasion was the rapid relocation of 1,500 large factories to preserve vital resources for the war effort.
A lot of this had to be dismantled, in fact, from the western side of the Soviet Union, put on trains, and then rebuilt in the eastern part of the Soviet Union, this is one of the reasons why they managed to claw things back in the end.
Meanwhile, the Nazi attack became increasingly focused on Leningrad, a city of strategic significance. The city's prime position on the Neva River offered easy access to the sea. It was the base of Russia's Baltic fleet of warships, destroyers, aircraft, torpedo boats, and submarines. And with more than 600 factories, Leningrad was second only to Moscow in industrial output. It was also of symbolic importance. Hitler was determined to destroy Leningrad, which he hated for its very name.
This was the birthplace of the Russian Revolution. It was named after Lenin.
As the Nazi forces advanced, Leningrad's terrified civilians raced to build trenches and anti-tank fortifications. The Nazis were advancing at speed, and the Russian Red Army and volunteer forces could not build their defenses quickly enough. The city was almost completely encircled by the Germans with their Finnish allies to the north. By September 8th, the only way in or out of Leningrad was by water, via the vast Lake Ladoga.
The camera can show but little of the suffering and death and horror that have reigned upon this heroic city in the long months during which the Nazis have vainly smashed at Leningrad's gates.
Eventually, though, the frantic trench building by Leningrad's inhabitants paid off. Soviet forces managed to bottle up the Germans in the city's suburbs. Hitler decided his forces would no longer continue to fight their way into Leningrad. Instead, he settled in for a siege. Hitler had no qualms about shelling and starving civilians to death. Any requests for surrender negotiations were to be ignored. The Nazis didn't want to feed 3 million Russians. Much now depended on the endurance of the inhabitants. If Leningrad fell, the Soviet Union's fate was all but sealed. December 7th, 1941. In a matter of minutes, 2 waves of almost 200 Japanese planes appeared above Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, killing 2,403 U.S. service personnel, destroying 188 aircraft and torpedoing 18 American warships. It was the worst disaster in American military history. Roosevelt could not have been less prepared. It was supposed to be a quiet Sunday at the White House. The president had just finished lunch and was about to attend to his vast stamp collection when he learned of the Pearl Harbor attack. His advisors warned that Japan could be planning to follow up with an attack on America's west coast. Roosevelt had no time to hesitate. His wife, Eleanor, described him as deadly calm, as he decided he had no choice but to rally the nation behind a war many had hoped to avoid.
Well, I think the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor, as Roosevelt famously said, a day that will live in infamy, was as big a turning point as you can have almost in the wider history of the Second World War. Up to that point, you could argue that for Roosevelt and for the isolationists within the American cabinet and the American Congress, did not want to be involved in what they saw as a European conflict and did not want to become an active military player in the Second World War. With the bombing of Pearl Harbor, of the American fleet in Hawaii, this, of course, literally brought the war to American shores.
The attack on Pearl Harbor shocked the world. Roosevelt wasted no time in making it clear that U.S. neutrality was over.
The American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
I think a lot of people were scared. A lot of people weren't happy about having to fight. Yeah, I think people were very scared that it could happen so close. Pearl Harbor happened on our land. A lot of people said, let's go, let's get them. I'm ready to go, and I'm ready to get these guys.
Had Roosevelt misjudged the national mood, his entire presidency would have been in jeopardy.
The vast majority of the American public recognizes that now the United States has had war brought to its shores, essentially, and it has to respond to that, as indeed Roosevelt does.
Roosevelt's declaration of war was passed within minutes. With only one vote against, it was clear America was no longer wedded to isolationism.
So Pearl Harbor is a significant defeat for the American forces in the Pacific, severely damages their ability to respond to the Japanese. But what it does do, of course, is unites American public opinion. That all of those doubts as to whether the war going on in Europe was part of America's business and whether America was best keeping out of wars were swept away because of the way that they'd been attacked.
At last, Churchill got what he wanted. But for Churchill, this was the wrong war. The U.S. was at war in the Pacific fighting Japan. Britain desperately needed the U.S. to join the fight against Hitler. For 3 long days, this remained in doubt. Japan also wanted the Germans to declare war on the U.S. On December 8, 1941, Japanese Ambassador Oshima visited Nazi Foreign Minister von Ribbentrop to request this, but von Ribbentrop stalled. He feared that U.S. involvement in Europe would tip the balance of power against the Axis. Roosevelt and Hitler's personal brinkmanship forced matters to a head.
Hitler makes his own decision to declare war on the United States. Roosevelt does try and provoke him to doing so by making a fireside chat on the 8th of December, where he says some very rude things about Hitler. He accuses Hitler of all sorts of aggressive actions, of conspiring with the Japanese and basically being behind what the Japanese had done.
3 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, first Mussolini, then Hitler declared war on America, claiming their pact of steel would bring about a new world order.
Hitler couldn't stand Roosevelt. He'd been very rude about him before, and if you listen to the speech that Hitler makes to the Reichstag when he declares war, he just rants about Roosevelt. Roosevelt clearly has got him on the raw, which I think was what Roosevelt intended to do.
There was a good reason, again, in Hitler's worldview, for attacking America, or for declaring war on America. And that was that, in his view, Jews were at the center of everything that was wrong with the world. And America, and particularly New York finance, large numbers of Jews in the banks and investment banks in New York, of course, were at the center of that. And therefore, in a perverse kind of logic, this was going to be part of his final settlement, final solution of the Jewish problem would be taking on and defeating America as well.
Roosevelt responded, arguing that the Axis powers were endeavoring to enslave the entire world and calling on all nations to unite against the forces of savagery and of barbarism. The American Congress and Senate were unanimous. In just 4 days, America went from glorious isolation to waging war on 2 fronts.
The Japanese did arrange for a submarine to lob shells towards Los Angeles when Roosevelt was giving one of his early wartime fireside chats, but by and large they posed no threat to the American mainland. But it shocked Americans out of this sense that we can steer clear of war.
Japan was already proving a deadly enemy. Hours after Pearl Harbor, Japanese planes struck airfields north of Manila in the Philippines, destroying more than half the fighters and bombers of the U.S. Army's Far East Air Force. 2 days later, further strikes obliterated Cavite Naval Yard, the Americans' only ship repair facility in the Philippines. The Americans were not the only victims of the Japanese attacks. As the Japanese blitzed through Asia, they singled out the British in Singapore, sinking the HMS Repulse and the HMS Prince of Wales, on which Churchill had crossed the Atlantic to meet Roosevelt, resulting in 840 British casualties. Over the course of 7 hours on December 8th, the Japanese launched simultaneous attacks on the British-held colonies of Malaya, Hong Kong, and Singapore. In one knockout blow, the Japanese sought to cripple the Western Allies and gain total mastery over Southeast Asia.
The issue that is absorbing the Japanese government right from 1931 onwards is how to sort out the China problem. They're at war there throughout the 1930s, undeclared at first, then declared on an ever-increasing scale. And of course, China just pulls in resources and pulls in difficulties and creates difficulties for Japan. But that's the number one problem so far as they see it. It's how to solve the Chinese problem.
2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, on December 22, 1941, Churchill arrived in Washington, D.C. to attend the Arcadia Conference. Stalin, who hated traveling, did not attend and sent the Russian ambassador to the U.S., Maxim Litvinov. On New Year's Day 1942, all three countries signed the United Nations Declaration, pledging to use all available resources to defeat the Axis powers and to create an organization dedicated to ensuring life, liberty, independence, religious freedom, the rights of man, and justice. Representatives of 26 other countries fighting the Axis signed the next day. But crucially, the declaration was driven by the Big Three. As 1941 drew to a close, the Axis powers were ravaging the globe. Could a communist, a capitalist, and a colonialist cooperate to defeat the Axis? Next time on Race to Victory, Britain and America needed to build a united front against the Axis powers by creating a blueprint to defeat fascism as well as a post-war vision. U.S. troops joined the British for the first time to battle the Axis forces in North Africa.
Churchill makes the famous quote about this not being the beginning of the end, this is the end of the beginning.
While the Soviets continued to fight on their motherland.
People of Leningrad were soon forced to start eating cats, mice, dogs, leather, whatever they could find to sustain themselves. There were cases of cannibalism.
And would America's reluctant entry into the war make enough of a difference to clinch victory?